Hello, I'm Yoram Hazony, and this is NatConTalk, where nationalism and conservatism meet. If you are enjoying our videos, you can help us out by hitting the like button and subscribing to this channel. Today I'll be speaking with Ryan Anderson. He's president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and author of the recently canceled book, When Harry Became Sally. Ryan Anderson, and welcome to NatConTalk.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you, Ryan. I just finished your book, When Harry Became Sally, which I think everybody by now knows has been banned from Amazon for its, I thought, intelligent and extremely persuasive discussion about the phenomenon of transgender activism and the effect it's having on our societies. The place I wanted to start with is the reason that you wrote this book. You write in the introduction, I couldn't shake from my mind the stories of people who had detransitioned. They are heartbreaking. I had to do what I could to prevent more people from suffering in the same way. Well, what does detransitioned even mean? And what is this suffering that you felt compelled to prevent?
Sure. So the concept of detransitioning or detransitioner is an individual who either hormonally or surgically transitioned. A male who attempted to live as if a female, went on estrogen, maybe had various surgeries, and then 5, 10, 15 years later realizes that it was a mistake. It didn't bring the happiness and the wholeness that they were seeking. And then they, quote, detransition, and they try to go back living, as what they are, in this case, a man. But obviously, after you've had certain surgeries, various body parts don't grow back. After you've been on hormones for a number of years, certain changes can be irreversible. And so I got to know one individual personally quite well. His name's Walt Heyer, and he was in his 50s when he transitioned. He lived as a woman, I believe it's for 8 years. And then he realized the mistake he made, and he attempted to get his life back and to live as a man again. And that's heartbreaking when it's someone who's middle-aged and this happens. It's even more just heart-rendering when you see this happening to kids and to teens. And so some of the I was just watching some videos of people sharing their stories, and you see like high school girls who are being told the answer to their problem is testosterone and a double mastectomy. And then in their mid-20s, they realize the mistake they made. And, the language they use is that, they now have a 5 o'clock shadow. Their voice has been permanently changed because of the testosterone effect in the vocal cords, and they have a scarred chest from the mastectomy. This is just incredibly tragic, incredibly heartbreaking. And what I saw was that no one else was speaking out against this. And there was something important that needed to be said. Because I think most of our listeners right now probably are, even if they're decently well informed in general, don't know, half of what's going on when it comes to the T in LGBT.
Well, that's definitely the way that I felt on reading the book. I felt that that I didn't really know what was going on, and I think it's worth reading the book just in order to know what's happening. But why don't you give us kind of a synopsis of what is happening? Let's just explain what is gender dysphoria, and what is it that people are being asked to do about it?
Sure. So originally the term gender dysphoria in previous editions of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is the APA's kind of handbook on psychiatry, it was known as gender identity disorder in the DSM-3, DSM-4, and then in DSM-5 it became gender dysphoria. And the basic idea is it's the distress that an individual experiences as a result of not feeling comfortable in their own body. So identifying as the opposite sex, not feeling comfortable as the sex that you are, and then the various forms of distress that come along with it. In the 60s and 70s, a radical new therapy was pioneered, saying, we can just reassign sex. And Johns Hopkins Hospital was one of the first stateside hospital that did this, in the United States. And then in the 70s, Dr. Paul McHugh shut it down. McHugh was a Harvard-trained, he was an undergraduate there. He got his medical degree at Harvard. And then he arrived at Hopkins, was promoted to psychiatrist in chief. He said, we've been doing this for over a decade now. Let's look at what the long-term outcomes are. Discovered it wasn't bringing the wholeness, the healing, the happiness, the kind of fullness that people were looking for. And he said, this isn't the solution. Shuts down the sex reassignment clinic and says what we should be doing is just traditional psychiatry. With anyone that has a body identity struggle, we should be helping them identify with reality. Fast forward 40 years, and in the last year of the Obama administration, all the various agencies say the word sex now means gender identity. That means all of our laws that ban discrimination on the basis of sex are now going to be read as banning it on gender identity. And what you have to do to avoid discrimination on the basis of gender identity is you have to treat people in a way that affirms their gender identity. That means, the bathroom that they use, the locker room that they use, the sports team that they play on, the pronoun that you have to use, and then also the medicine that now becomes a civil right. Puberty blocking drugs for kids, cross-sex hormones for teens, surgery for teens. In one instance, we have records of a government-funded study in California where two 13-year-old girls had double mastectomies performed on their body as part of their treatment for gender dysphoria, right? And so this was unheard of, a decade or two ago, and now it's claiming the mantle of civil rights. And it's just breathtaking how quickly this all happened. I think most well-intentioned Americans have no idea how far it's gone. And it's just something that, once I saw it, I couldn't stay quiet. And partly that's the type of personality I have, but partly it's truly horrific when you see the lives that are being upended because of a bad ideology.
Okay, so it seems like there are two parts to this. There's the medical side, where all sorts of people, some of them very, very young, are being kind of channeled in the direction of therapies, which can often end up in really aggressive surgery, destructive surgery, as you're describing. And then there's the civil rights side. Let's just begin with this issue of the medical side of it. Now, in your book, you say that 80 to 95% of young people who experience some kind of confusion about their own gender, a boy who thinks maybe he's a girl who thinks maybe she's a boy, 80 to 95% of them end up, if you leave them alone without any kind of treatment, they end up coming out, your average man and your average woman. Is that true? How can that be true?
Yep. So that is true, and that statistic comes right out of the DSM-5, right? So I'm just relying on the APA's own published handbook on psychiatric conditions, and what the best research shows is that for adolescents, 80 to 95% of the time, if you just give them the time and the space to develop, their gender identity conflict will naturally resolve. Which is why many medical doctors were alarmed when they started engaging in puberty blocking drugs and cross-sex hormones, because they were like, look, this is going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you take a 7-year-old boy who doesn't quite feel comfortable as a boy and you place him on puberty blocking drugs and then you give him estrogen, well, that's a one-way ratchet. Of course, he's only going to continue feeling like he's not a boy, because when all the other boys hit their growth spurt, they go through puberty, their voice deepens, and his doesn't, you're setting him up to further entrench the gender dysphoria, right? And you may actually be blocking the developmental pathway that does lead to the 80 to 95% of the time, the reconciliation of the identity with the body. That when that boy who doesn't quite feel comfortable today, when he hits puberty, when his voice deepens, when his muscles develop, when all the standard things that go on during the pubertal process where a boy develops into a man, if you let him go through that, that's a high chance that he's going to, reconcile his identity with his body. But if you block it, this may very well be, kind of setting him up for a permanent alienation from his body. Now, I should add that that is historically kind of how researchers thought about gender dysphoria, or the previous classification, gender identity disorder in children. Lisa Littman, a researcher at Brown University, published a paper just a couple years ago pointing out that there's a new form of gender dysphoria, which she called rapid onset gender dysphoria, which was taking place much more often in like teenage girls and 20-something girls. And these were, young women who had no history of any struggles with their gender identity, who all of a sudden, rapidly seem to have the onset of gender dysphoria, and it seems to take place within clusters. And she was saying, look, something else is going on here. This is something new under the sun. Many researchers have said there's probably a social contagion aspect to this, the idea that there are various ideas that can be spread throughout communities, and that's where you would see clusters of people with gender dysphoria. And that with this form of gender dysphoria, it's not any longer just, a boy who identifies as a girl who identifies as a boy, but people who identify as non-binary. People who are just rejecting the entire classification system of boys and girls, men and women, right? They identify as gender fluid, gender ambidextrous, et cetera, which suggests that now we have a totally new phenomenon when it comes to the rapid onset gender dysphoria. And you certainly don't want to rush into telling this population that testosterone and mastectomies is what's going to bring them long-term healing and happiness. And yet that's what's happening under the guise of civil rights, which I think makes it even more difficult to have the discussion, because you're not just having a good faith discussion about, science and medicine, but now one side of the debate's being framed as if, they're bigots and civil rights deniers.
Well, it looks like this really is a zero-sum game. It's very hard to see how there can be compromise if the position that you and other traditionalists are taking is that really young people who feel some kind of confusion about their gender should be pretty much left alone to grow, because most of them will be okay. And this is in sharp, extreme conflict with a group of people that in your book you call gender activists, who want to see pretty much, if I'm getting this right, pretty much any kid who exhibits some kind of confusion being put into the beginnings of this four-step therapy that you're describing. So there's no compromise here. This is a clash that, at least with regard to kids, has to go one way or the other.
I think that's right with respect to kids. America is a free country. If Bruce wants to become Caitlin, we can kind of find a way to compromise, live and let live when it comes to adults. And then, we just need to figure out what sort of regulations we're going to have when it comes to athletics and things like that. But when it comes to children, I struggle to see, what would be a satisfactory middle of the road compromise here, because, my side of this discussion thinks that this is unethical experimentation on the minds and the bodies of minors. They are unable to consent to it. And even if they could consent to it, consent doesn't turn unethical medicine into ethical medicine, right? So I think there are two concerns here: that they're minors and they can't be consenting to these sorts of life-changing procedures. And that two, regardless of whether there's consent or not, these sorts of procedures conducted on the body of a minor just strike me as drastically unethical. And when you combine those things, when you are a 13-year-old girl who is struggling to fit in at school, who might be coming from a family environment that has problems, or a school environment, a social environment that has problems, you have no appreciation for what it's going to be like when you're in your late 20s, early 30s, and you can't nurse a baby, right? And for many women, the ability to bear a child and then to nurse a child is one of the most fulfilling things they will ever do in life. And yet, we have doctors, some of the videos you can find on YouTube are truly disturbing, where they're like, oh, we can always use, if we perform the mastectomy and then later she wants breasts, we can always give them breasts back later. And it's just so cavalier some of the language that some of the gender activists, including medical doctors who are gender activists, use on this. So anyway, so I think you're right. I think when it comes to kids, it's really hard for me to see what the compromise is, because my side of this debate thinks this is unethical medicine that should be prohibited by law. And the other side of the debate wants to see parents lose custody of their kids if they don't transition their kids, right? And that just seems irreconcilable.
I think one of the most shocking parts of the book is actually you go into quoting various medical professionals about parallel disorders, that things that are maybe more familiar to us and that are strikingly similar. For example, anorexia is something most people have heard of, where a young person, usually a young woman, feels that her body is overweight, or sees her body, experiences her body as being overweight, and begins to starve herself. And lots of these cases end in death. There's some famous ones. We have someone in our neighborhood where a 12-year-old girl went through this and didn't make it. And people are familiar with anorexia, which is clearly a disorder. The girl in question is not overweight. She's actually starving to death, and yet she experiences her body as though it is fat, and keeps aggressively attacking her body to try to make it not fat. And so some of the people you interview propose that this, among other disorders, can be considered parallel. That you have a young man who, for some period, sees himself maybe as a young woman, and vice versa. And how could it be that one of these is anorexia is universally acknowledged to be a disorder that needs treatment in the direction of helping the young woman or man recognize that they're not overweight? You're trying to help them stop being under the illusion that they're overweight. And yet, in this case, where a young man or a young woman are under the feeling or impression that they're the opposite gender, we are going with it. We're encouraging it. We're supporting it, and in fact trying to make it a reality. It seems difficult to reconcile these two treatments.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, that is the prime contradiction, where, because the civil rights movement has said, look, the real gender identity is whatever it is, so you have to transform the body to line up with the gender identity, rather than what psychiatrists and psychologists and other counselors do in every other situation. When someone has, a belief or a feeling that isn't in accord with reality, what they try to do is they help people line up their thoughts and their feelings with reality, including the reality of their bodies. So I mean, Dr. McHugh uses that analogy to anorexia and says, look, if you have a high school girl struggling with anorexia, you don't prescribe liposuction because there's nothing wrong with her body. But you do try to figure out, is this an eating disorder per se? Is this a body image problem? Is it more about food, or is it more about and control with respect to food, or is it more about a self-image as being overweight? Is this the result of a sexual abusive relationship? Is it the result of an overbearing mother, a result of a family dynamic, a result of a school environment? We find that eating disorders are more common in all girls schools, where the girls are competing with each other. Who knows, right? Because in every patient, there's going to be a unique underlying cause. And what a good therapist would try to do is figure out, for this patient, what's the underlying cause of the anorexia? Is it a family dynamic? Is it a school dynamic? Is it a sexual dynamic? And then you're going to address the therapy at that underlying cause. And McHugh says you should do the same thing for gender dysphoria. See, for this patient, why does this patient have thoughts and feelings that don't line up with reality, including the reality of their body? and then address the therapy at that underlying cause. Right now in the United States, I believe it's up to 14 states. Dr. McHugh would lose his medical license if he practiced medicine in that way with a minor with gender dysphoria, because the government calls it conversion therapy, right? And yet in all 50 states, if a doctor were to prescribe puberty blocking drugs or cross-sex hormones to a minor, that's entirely legal. But if a doctor tries to help a minor feel comfortable in his or her own body, in a quarter of the states, that doctor could lose his or her medical license.
Is there something going wrong with the medical profession? It's one thing to talk about woke ideology or the new Marxism when we're talking about professors who are encouraging people to think about encouraging young people to think a certain way about race or the economy. None of these things, as far as I know offhand, cause doctors to start doing radical surgeries on the bodies of people. And so I think part of why this is so much more shocking than other parts of the woke agenda is that we have this assumption that the medical profession is supposed to be helping heal us. Some of the people you interview in the book talk about doctors who basically think that the relationship between a doctor and a patient is one of contract. This kind of idea of liberal exchange, that if the patient wants some service and is willing to pay for it, and the doctor is willing to do the service, then why shouldn't he do it? That's what a liberal society of freedom and exchange is about. But here it really seems that what you're describing is circumstances in which you can't count on the doctor that you go to see, who's supposed to be an expert in this field, to protect you and to try to heal you. Just the opposite. And that's very difficult to think that we might have to stop trusting the medical profession.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and there's a lot there. What you're seeing is that the type of college student who majors in gender studies and then goes to med school to be a gender expert is self-selected. And so what I have found was that many mainstream endocrinologists or mainstream pediatricians or mainstream psychiatrists said what's going on makes no sense, but they're not, quote, the gender experts. And so the subcommittees of the pediatric societies or the endocrine societies that draft the statements that say, this is the official guidelines for gender dysphoria, it's kind of like regulatory capture. But take it out of the policy discussion and put it inside of these professional associations. The type of doctor who wants to study sex reassignment is probably the type of doctor that has a vested interest in the outcome of those studies, right? And it's very few people like Mark Regnerus or Paul McHugh who are willing to kind of blow the whistle. And then the other thing I'll say there is that many of the physicians who have helped me on my research have done so only on strict condition of strict anonymity, that they are afraid that they will lose their jobs. Some of them don't have tenure. Some of them aren't even sure that with tenure that their deans and their provosts and their presidents would stand up for them when the mob comes. And you can see therefore how destructive that environment is for good research and good science and good medicine. That we actually need the ability for people to speak freely on an issue like this. And so, one of the casualties of something like cancel culture is a whole bunch of good doctors feel like they have to censor themselves. More and more, some physicians are speaking out. And so there are some, anytime you see a physician speaking out on this, just realize how incredibly courageous and heroic they are, because most of them didn't go into medicine to fight culture wars or to do kind of like political stuff. And so anytime they're speaking out, they're kind of putting their neck on the line, and they deserve our admiration. I think these people are incredibly courageous right now.
We've been talking about the impact on detransitioners, on kids or adults who later come to feel that they've made a mistake. Are there any studies that give us some insight into how often does do these radical sexual transitioning therapies, how often do they help people? Let's just speak, psychologically. How often do they make people feel happy? How often are they whole with themselves? As you said, once they've gone through these therapies and done the surgeries, how does it turn out?
So the best studies show the poorest outcomes, which is simply to say that there are lots of studies out there, and the ones that the media tends to highlight and the ones that the activists tend to highlight are the poorly conducted ones that almost seem as if they were designed to produce a certain conclusion, which is that transitioning benefits patients. But the studies that use the largest data sets, that use randomized selection procedures, and that look longitudinally, which is simply to say that, kind of like the studies that are best conducted using social science methodology, those are the ones that show the poorest outcomes for patients. And what I mean by that is, just last year, the largest study data set wise that had ever been conducted, media touted it as saying that, surgical transition brings mental health benefits to patients. Mark Regnerus crunched the numbers and said, actually, you guys made a mistake. 10 months later, the journal issued a formal correction, now acknowledging that neither hormonal transition nor surgical transition brought any benefits to patients, and that on two metrics, transition actually brought an increase of mental health struggles. That wasn't reported by the media. The other thing is that some of the largest studies that we have also show increased suicide attempts and unfortunately increased death by suicide. And this is something that even the Obama administration acknowledged. I quote in the book, a study that came out in 2016 from the Obama Medicaid and Medicare Services Department, pointing out it's a study from Sweden that showed 10 years after sex reassignment procedures, patients who had the reassignment surgery, I think the exact stat, were 19 times more likely than the general population to die by suicide. And this was not a study conducted in like Alabama or Mississippi or somewhere where they can say, oh, it's the culture is really stigmatizing. This was in about as progressive and accepting of a culture as you can imagine. And we're still seeing these poor outcomes, right? Which leads, a thinker like me to say, it's not the culture that's being unfair to individuals, although I have no doubt that happens. But the deeper underlying cause here is that if you try to live in a way that's not in accord with nature, it's not going to bring the wholeness and the happiness that you're looking for. This is just the Aristotelian inside of me saying that if you fight against nature, it's not going to bring you what you're looking for. And tragically, according to the data, it in some cases takes a really, really tragic outcome with the attempted or completed suicides.
So this is beginning to look like, a lot of other things in our culture where there's two camps. They're looking at, completely contradictory sets of facts. We have one set of doctors who are specialists saying gender dysphoria should be treated through this radical four-step procedure. We have other doctors saying the opposite. Now we're saying that the long-term studies that are done also, there's a disagreement between people who see that these procedures actually can do terrible harm, or at least don't help, and those who take other studies and say, well, no, actually they help. Is there any kind of objective measure that you could use in order to determine whether a young man or a young woman should be put into this four-step process?
Sure. I mean, look, the objective standard is human nature itself. I mean, what the studies, can at most try to show are what are the consequences of, transitioning. But even if the studies show that somehow, look, people can, transition and they don't suffer from depression or anxiety, that still wouldn't answer the objective question of what's the reality of the human person, right? And so if you're asking someone, what's the objective standard here? Is that a boy who is male, right, but who is not feeling comfortable identifying as a boy, what that child deserves is help at feeling comfortable with his reality. And his reality is the reality, right? It's not like my personal reality is blah, blah, blah. The way that when I was an undergrad at Princeton, I think the New Jersey governor, did some press release where he's like, my truth is like, that's not what I'm getting at. The, Anthony Kennedy spin on truth. What I'm getting at here is that there's a reality of that child. That child either is a boy or a girl. And what we as adults owe to those children is to help them embrace reality, to help them feel comfortable with reality, help them to flourish as the type of creature they are, right? Again, this is the Aristotelian inside of me, is that, we are created with certain natures and we flourish when we live in accordance with nature. And then what the studies can do is just show us, all right, well, what are the consequences of not doing that? And then people are going to debate, is it a 19 time more likely outcome of suicide, or is it only 18, or maybe it's 20, right? Is it no improvement, or is it slight disprovement, right? I mean, it's that's all, I think, a secondary consideration, right? The social sciences is the same thing with on the gay marriage debate. The social science was a secondary consideration. The primary concern was just, what's the nature of marriage? And the primary concern here is, what's the nature of the human person as an embodied creature, male and female?
In other words, you're saying that actually this ends up coming down to liberal claims regarding autonomy. It's about freedom. That if the goal is to liberate people from social constraints, then eventually what we end up is the goal of liberating people from biological constraints.
The gender activists want to say that there's some Gnostic form of knowledge, right? A secret knowledge that only you possess. So that's one way that it's Gnostic. And then the other way that it's Gnostic is that it's a dualism. It's a Gnostic dualism in which the real self is something other than the body. And then we can align the body to match up with the real self. And so obviously, I mean, I think these things are related. That to a certain extent, a bad conception of autonomy, a bad conception of liberty and of freedom thinks that what liberty, autonomy, freedom are is the unencumbered self, just kind of like making use of material stuff to align material stuff, whether it's physical, exterior realities or the own, physical body to shape it in accordance with the self. So that's how I would think of this. I think there are two competing anthropologies on offer, two competing metaphysics of human nature. And as a result, you then get two competing theories of freedom and liberty and autonomy. And so, the version of liberty that I would defend is rightly ordered liberty, right? That can distinguish liberty from license. It's liberty in accordance with nature, liberty in accordance with natural law, liberty in accordance with God's law. And that's different than a radical form of autonomy, which says there are no limits. It's all kind of there for the autonomous self to do with as sees fits. But then the only kind of like qualification there is that I don't want to make it seem like people with gender dysphoria are, autonomously choosing, to either experience that discomfort from the body, or in many circumstances, to even autonomously choosing the gender with which they now identify. Right? I think for many of these people, they're a victim of a bad culture in which they don't feel comfortable and they don't experience it as a choice, right? But they're being told that the only choice they can make is to transition and to take the hormones, et cetera, et cetera. Does that kind of clarify? Because I think we're agreeing. It's just, I kind of want to just put a
Oh,
little
no.
qualification.
Look, we're definitely agreeing about how horrifying efforts to try to put children into these deep alterations of their bodies. On that, we certainly agree. I'm not an Aristotelian, and my tradition almost has the opposite view of nature from the Aristotelian tradition. I think having metaphysical arguments is interesting and it's important, but the bottom line is that what we care about is the health and the good of these young people who I think you've convincingly shown in this book that they're actually being oppressed. We always hear that it's transgender people who are oppressed, but I think that your book, and maybe this is why it's caused so much consternation, is you get to the end of this book and you come out thinking, maybe there's some oppression of transgender people, but what about the oppression of the people who are being pushed into these very extreme therapies and then have no way the rest of their lives of being able to undo the damage? I think you're right. I think it's clearly an oppression, and a person who's a decent person, a righteous person, regardless of their particular philosophical tradition, I think can see that you're right about this.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope so, and I think that's probably what makes the book threatening to the censors, right? My guess is that the reason why Amazon decided to get rid of the book was that it's persuasive. It changes people's minds. The person who sits down saying, I don't know what I think about transgender issues, I'm going to sit down and read Ryan's book, 200 and some pages later, they come away from it saying exactly what you just said. Like, I mean, that's my hope as the author of the book. I can't say in my own voice whether or not it succeeds in doing that, but it strikes me that you don't get rid of, if you're Amazon, books that don't make a difference, right? Why go through all of this? Why create this negative media cycle for you unless you think that there's something actually dangerous about the book? And what would make the book dangerous is that it actually is providing people with facts, figures, information, arguments, philosophy, science, etc., that might make a difference.
Look, the removal of the book from Amazon is obviously disturbing and shocking in all sorts of other ways. I actually wanted to press you a little bit before we go into Amazon and the free market of ideas, to press you a little bit about the civil rights side of this. What does it do to women or other protected groups if we continue down this path? I mean, one of the important things that I think one of the important things that you emphasize in the book, this, you might even say this generally about liberal political theories, is that they tend to look at the freedom of a particular type or class of individual and to slight the damage that's being done to everybody else. Somebody's given a right and they say, well, I have this right. The right then has this kind of tendency to become sort of absolute. So what happens if you do give a right of complete equality in all contexts to the transgendered? Who does that harm? What's wrong with that?
Sure. Sorry, it's going to harm them, but even beyond that, big picture situations. If you now say in civil rights law that a man who identifies as a woman has a civil right to compete against women in athletics, to compete on the girls' track team, to compete against the girl senior, in the high school track championship race, that's going to be harming actual women from their actual equality, right? The reason that we have separate athletic competitions for men and women is that our bodily differences make a difference when it comes to physical competition. And if you allow males who identify as females to compete against actual females, you can predict how that story is going to end. It's going to have negative consequences in kind of a private facilities situation. So right now there's a battered women's shelter that's being sued because they wouldn't allow a man who identifies as a woman to spend the night in the women's shelter. And you know, I imagine most of our viewers haven't, you know, God, you know, thank God that we haven't had to ever spend the night at a homeless shelter or something like that. But it's not like this is staying at the Ritz-Carlton. This is like a gymnasium with a cot every 3 feet. And so it's entirely understandable why a homeless woman wouldn't want to have a man who identifies as a woman in the cot right next door. Okay? I think sometimes elites can just discard, oh, it's not a big deal. Who cares about bathrooms? Who cares about locker rooms? Who cares about sports? Like, I think it is a big deal for the women who are going to be impacted. And then it would have consequences for medicine. Will you, one, be able to practice good medicine? I already mentioned that McHugh could lose his medical license in, you know, a dozen states. But then two, will you be forced to practice bad medicine? And what I mean by that is if you are a surgeon who performs double mastectomies in the case of breast cancer, will the civil rights law now require you to perform them in the case of sex reassignment? There's a Catholic hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, that is currently being sued by the ACLU because they declined to do a hysterectomy for a woman who wants to identify as a man. This can also be detrimental to the LGBT identified individual, him or herself. And there's a example of this, of someone who was identifying as a man, went to an emergency room complaining of stomach pain. And because he was identifying as a man and presenting as a man, they didn't think to give him a ultrasound to see if he was pregnant, right? Because the reality here is that he was a woman, she was pregnant. And I think as a result of that, there was a miscarriage. I don't know what ended up happening to the mother in that situation, but the child passed away, right? Medicine needs to take bodies seriously.
Look, I think realistically, we're living through a period, or have been for decades, in which traditions are being overthrown. The way that traditional communities understand man and woman, or marriage, or family, and many other things, are being systematically discredited and destroyed. And so there remain mostly within traditional religious communities, whether they're Christian or Jewish or Hindu or Muslim or other, it's mostly within those religious communities that the traditions that bear the old ways of thinking and behaving, those traditions persist, and that's why we end up with this kind of feeling that this is a religious issue, because there may be some people who are not religious and not part of any tradition who agree with you and me on this, but the people who are, most of the people who really think that it's it's do or die. We have no choice but to fight this. They really do appear to be Catholics, such as yourself, or other religious people. I think that's part of the reality. And my sense is that we may have religious communities may have simply taken a wrong turn quite a few decades ago in speaking as though religion isn't part of the general public debate. Back in the 1980s, it was still under debate. Ronald Reagan or Jerry Falwell were committed to the idea that if you have religiously motivated or religiously based or traditionally based views on these issues, that your voice is just as legitimate as somebody else who has stripped God and tradition and scripture out of the discussion. And I sort of feel that today there are maybe too many people who want to present their arguments in a way that is stripped of the religious motivations, when really we should be saying that these religious motivations are legitimate. I don't know if you see it that way.
Oh, I entirely agree, but I think religious motivations are different than religious liberty claims, right? So I mean, I'm fully with Newhouse. I'm against the naked public square. I'm against Rawlsian public reason standards. I think what we owe to the public square is that we come with our traditions, right? With our traditions of rationality, whether it's theological or philosophical, right? I'm with McIntyre here that what a tradition is, it's a tradition of rationality. We bring those things to bear in the public square precisely for the common good of that political community. And so this is where I think the counsel to Americans is not just to say my religious tradition is something that is kind of like this idiosyncratic private belief system that I have, and what I ask of law is for religious liberty exemptions or something like that. Like right. What I think you're saying and what I'm saying is that like we actually need to bring to bear our faith traditions as they intersect and as they impact the common good of the political community. And this is what Newhouse was getting at with his book, The Naked Public Square. Is what as you pointed out, Reagan was still up for this. And so, yeah, it's going to be people of faith, both, Catholic and Protestant and Jew and LDS and Muslim and other traditions. But I also think we should partner with people who don't have particular religious faith. I've been working with a lot of secular women who see the threats to their privacy, their safety, and their equality with perfect clarity. And they are willing to speak out against this, even though they don't come from a particular theological tradition. So I would say it needs to be a both and, right? So people like you and me should be speaking from within our religious traditions. We should also be partnering with people who don't share a religious tradition, who have, purely secular reasons for being concerned. And it should be a big tent coalition. Because on something like this, I mean, I think this is the type of thing where common sense can get you a pretty far way down the field.
Have you found that there are feminists who are responsive to your offer of a coalition?
Yes, I mean, so I mean, the most prominent feminist in this category is J.K. Rowling, and you can see how she was then attacked and canceled. And what I have found is that the professional leadership class of the professional feminist organizations are almost all in the tank as social justice warriors, intersectionality, yada, yada, yada. And so it's, new, independent, courageous kind of like female leaders who are speaking out against this. And back when I was at Heritage, I hosted 2 different events with, self-described radical feminists. One of the groups, the title is WOLF, the Women's Liberation Front. And what they argued was that the gender identity bills undoes their liberation, right? So now, obviously, they're coming from a different perspective than you and I are on that underlying question of autonomy and of liberty. But they agreed with us on the threat that gender identity-based laws pose. And so again, like, we don't yet agree on everything, but we agree on enough that we can partner. And they were willing to partner with a group like Heritage. One of them, when she got to the podium, says, I can't believe I'm about to say this, but thank you to the Heritage Foundation for doing for me what no left-leaning organization in America would, providing me a platform. So I do think those interesting coalitions can exist. My sense is that there are more J.K. Rowlings and Andrew Sullivans out there than we might appreciate. And the reason I mentioned Andrew has also spoken out against some of the trans extremism. I think ordinary American women are not on board with this trans extremism, even if the organizations that claim to represent ordinary American women are keeping quiet about it. Right? I think there really is a disconnect between the leadership class and then ordinary people on these sorts of cultural issues.
Ryan, I want to shift gears a little bit and get your ideas about the future of the Republican Party. I know that thinking about creative coalitions is something that you've done, a lot of people feel that we are in the midst of some kind of big realignment of the political party system in the United States, in addition to the fact that we've now had two consecutive American elections in which the outcomes were resisted or disputed or questioned by large segments of the population. Where do you see things going from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the future of the conservative movement, Republican Party, needs to be a blue-collar economic agenda and a socially conservative social agenda. And you already see people like Rubio moving in that direction. My colleague, now that I'm at EPPC, Henry Olsen, has been talking about this for a decade. I mean, Olsen, before Trump ever was even a candidate, he wrote a book about Ronald Reagan. I think the subtitle was something like The Working Class Republican, or the Blue Collar Republican, saying that the hagiography around Reagan, in which he's just a supply sider, or that Reagan is just a free trader, or just a whatever kind of like the libertarian talking heads want to kind of capture Reagan as their guy, isn't true. And and so somewhere behind me is my copy of Henry's book, where Henry spells out that Reagan was a working class Republican, and that meant he was a social conservative and he was an economic populist. And I think something like that is going to be true moving forward. The devil is going to be in the details. Like, not every policy proposal that goes under the banner of populism or common good or something like that actually is a good idea, right? Just because you are labeling it and framing it using those terms doesn't mean that the actual policy proposal that you put forward is achieving those goals. But I think that's how we should increasingly be thinking about this: is does this given piece of policy strengthen families? Does it strengthen religious communities? Does it strengthen civil societies? Does it strengthen national economies? Yes or no, right? And those are the sorts of questions we should be asking, and not just does it advance liberty? Liberty is important, but it's not the only thing that's important, right? And so I think one nice thing that comes out of the past two election cycles is a greater appreciation for kind of the complexity of the common good, that there are lots of things that we should be concerned about, and that liberty isn't the only one. It's certainly not the highest one. That the problem of libertarianism is that it takes one aspect of the common good that we should care about, and it makes it seem like it's the only one or the most important one.
Ryan Anderson, thank you for joining us on NatConTalk.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.